I'm a cop. I've been an officer for quite some time. Before I go and start my story, I just need to say one thing. This is by far the craziest story I've ever had. The craziest thing I've ever seen. And the following account takes place over the course of a couple of days, and I've noted it here in my journal. Day 1. Greer, Indiana. It's a small town, let me tell you. Everybody knows everything about everybody. You can't walk in the street without your fourth-door neighbor talking to you about what you had for dinner last night. It's a really small town. So small, the notion of personal space and boundaries is, well, it's quasi-non-existent. Which is why I like working the night shift. Everybody's asleep by then, so I don't have to play the good cop citizen and entertain boring conversations with Miss Gibbons about her boring cat or her kids. Or even tell drunk Joe to go back to his wife before I have to arrest him for misconduct. It might be a small town, bland and a bit boring, but let me tell you, I love it here. I might not always like the people, but it's peaceful. I haven't had to draw my gun in the past 24 years, and last I did was because some speedy assholes were racing through town on their motorcycle. Jake was his name. It was the nephew of Rick, and he had an arrest warrant because he'd stolen some gas at the last stop. I guess he was high on something because, well, when I finally managed to get him to slow down and told him to show me his papers, he showed me a gun instead. I got really quick on the trigger with that one, but it was self-defense, and we found out later that the gun he had was empty, but that still doesn't excuse him for pointing a gun at me. An officer with a license to kill, if forced to do it. It's a shame, though. He was really young. Shook up the whole town for a while, but you know what? Nobody blamed me. They all knew what kind of a kid he was. Anyway, I'm moving on. I'm rambling at this point. Tonight's been pretty calm. Mrs. Tabby Johnson called the station to say she saw something in the cemetery facing her house. So I'm going there to check if everything's good. And for all we know, she might have seen a bear or a big raccoon. I'm still the only cop awake at this hour, so I can't really skip duties. Not that I would. I wasn't doing much outside of snoozing in my corner, waiting for someone to burn a red light near me. So, I get this call. And I get there, and I see nothing, so obviously I get out of my car and make my way through the cemetery. I got my flashlight going left and right, and I still can't see shit. I'm about to turn around when, bam! I see something from the corner of my eyes, like a little kid running behind a tombstone, but I only had the time to catch his heel before it disappeared. And so I say to him, "Hey, it's a little late to be playing here, don't you think?" And I get no replies, and I'm just a tiny bit worried, so I jog to the tombstone, only to find out that there's nothing behind it. And once I've flashed the whole cemetery again, I can't see anything. No steps on the grass, no trace of the kid. And curiously, I look at the tombstone. It's written, "In loving memory of Edmund, 1834 to 1839. Poor kid. I go back to my car and call the station back, saying the cemetery is clear. I'm a little shook, but this isn't enough to scare an old goat like me. On day 2, I've been called again to the graveyard for the second night in a row by, guess who? Mrs. Johnson. And tonight, she's saying that the vandals are making noises and desecrating tombstones. She even saw a fire, she said. I turned the lights on, but no alarm because it's ass o'clock in the morning, and I don't want to scare the whole neighborhood. Just the kids who are messing with Mrs. J. I didn't sleep too well when my shift ended last time, So I just want to make sure I can get rid of this problem as soon as I can so I could go back to my work nap, which should last about 4 or 5 hours. And this is why I like working night shifts. Very little to do. Very little ever to do. So, I'm getting out of my car. I make my way into the graveyard. And it's as empty as one would expect a graveyard to be at 3 in the morning. The leaves bristling in the trees as a small cold breeze shakes them. But other than that, not a sound, not a peep. It's even a bit chilly tonight, so a fire wouldn't have been a bad thing to deal with. And so I start walking through the rows of tombstones, sometimes reading the names on them. There's nothing here. I turn around, and I hear a chuckle. It's childish, like what you would hear between two toddlers who told each other a joke, and only them would understand. It sounds a bit disembodied, though, much like an old recording. And I'm starting to think that someone's playing a prank on me. And it wouldn't be the first. It's still October and the kids are getting restless with Halloween coming up so soon. So I yell out, "Who's there?" And I use my flashlight again and see something dashing behind a tombstone. And this time, I run after it. And let me tell you, I may be lazy and I might sleep a couple hours out of my shift, but I can run like hell. And it's a child. I fucking knew it. There's a goddamn goblin in the cemetery, and it's probably the same kid that I saw last night. And he probably thinks he's funny to give the scare to a cop, but at the same time, if it's the same kid as yesterday, shouldn't he be sleeping? He seemed a little young to be running around so freely so late at night. "What are you doing here? Where are your parents?" I called out to him. No answers, and quite honestly, why would there be? I'm a cop, and he's a kid probably vandalizing the cemetery at midnight. So, I walk up to where the kid is standing, and I put my hand on its shoulder. And he feels icy. And my blood turns cold. My brows furrow. And I turn him around, only to be greeted with the sight of a face with 2 black holes instead of eyes, and a strange, moving darkness corrupting the edge of his skull. I jump back, drop my flashlight, and yell in surprise. But once I pick up my flashlight and flash it toward the kid, I only see a black cat, and it's hissing at me furiously. I am so shaken that I had to take a few seconds to look around. But I didn't feel like calling out for the kid. And I got to thinking, it might have been something I ate. After all, I hadn't been feeling very well that day. On day 3, Mrs. Johnson didn't call tonight, but I still go to the cemetery. I spend the following 4 hours checking out every movement before deciding I need to rest. I haven't been getting much sleep for a couple of days, and I've snapped at my wife today for something completely ridiculous. Which reminds me, I'll have to ask her to forgive me later. After I've had my sleep, obviously. I was about to close my eyes when I see it again. Dashing out of my car, I run after the kid, but I'm surrounded by giggles, and all I can see is his back. His plain white clothes and the fact that he's barefooted. I yell after him to stop running, and the strange disembodied fit of laughter seems to be getting louder by the second. The deeper I go into the cemetery, the louder the laughter. I feel my heart thump loudly in my chest, and I start to sweat. But it's not because I'm running. I'm scared as hell. The droplets are cold, just like the blood rushing through my veins as the kid turns around and smiles at me. His lips are a deep shade of blue. The holes in his skull are bigger than I thought, and the corruption of darkness upon his cheeks make him look demonic. And for the second time, I feel like reality is escaping me. I must be hallucinating, but this time, I didn't eat anything weird and I felt okay. Not that I had yesterday, but I wanted to believe this wasn't in my head, that there was logical explanation to what I was seeing. But there's none. All there is this child staring at me with his eyeless figure and never-ending smile. I feel like if I stay here, something terrible is going to happen. Dead, he says to me. He points a finger at me and I feel like the ground is vanishing beneath my foot. This thing is going to kill me. This isn't a child. This is a demon, and I almost regret I don't carry a rosary anymore because I'd pray to God to spare me. I don't know what compels me, but I get my gun out and I shoot. I empty my cartridge at it, but it vanishes into thin air with a laugh. And all I'm left with is a dead cat and the beginning of what feels like cardiac arrest. There's a pressure on my chest, my left arm is burning, and I taste bile in the back of my throat. And for a second, I really think that I'm going to die, but then the laughter stops and all I can hear is the deafening sound of my own heart. I pick up the dead cat and I look around to see if anybody saw me, but all the lights around the cemetery are off, even Mrs. Johnson's. I throw the poor animal in a bag I found in the trunk and dispose of it in the container behind the police station. Day 4. It's at this point that my instincts tell me to stop, to drop the whole cemetery thing, but man, I can't. Even without Mrs. Johnson's calls, I have to go there. It's not morbid curiosity. I need confirmation. Confirmation that I'm not going crazy and that I'm still a sane person. I mean, Jesus, I just killed cats for fuck's sake. And I had to justify that to my chief when I told him I emptied all my bullets on a cat. He was unsatisfied with my answer. Told me that if I needed to talk, we had resources. And believe it or not, he gave me new bullets. But I couldn't be honest and tell him what I actually saw. If I did, it would have sounded even crazier than my made-up story about thinking I've seen someone in danger and shot, only to find out it was a cat. Anyway, I promised him to do an eye test as soon as possible, but before that, I wanted to confirm my sanity, I guess. So swallowing heavily, I took the keys out of the starter and made my way into the cemetery. There's not a noise. It's about 2:30 in the morning. Only the wind shaking the leaves and the distant sound of wind chimes from Mrs. Johnson's balcony. I lean on a tombstone and look around, but there's nothing. It's as empty as it should. And maybe I just didn't have enough sleep in the past few days, and those hallucinations are the price I pay for it. Or maybe it is something else entirely. I'm not much of a supernatural believer, you see. I try to stay away from all that stuff. So I start to walk again, this time toward my car, determined to make this my last night in the cemetery. This is it. I am done after this. I have got to get my head on straight. I'm going to figure out what this is, and I'm out of here. And besides, it's a creepy place to be. Probably the creepiest place in Greer, to be completely honest. I was about to step past the fence when I hear the kids laugh again. I freeze on the spot, and I could feel its intense stare on the back of my neck. How could something without eyes be able to stare so intently? and my hair stand on end as I turn around, and I'm faced with that dead child and its creepy-ass smile. I instinctively reach for my gun, but decide against it. This time, the kid's feet aren't touching the ground, and the laughter sounds like it's being carried by the wind. And I'm starting to think it's actually the wind chimes fucking with me, but when I see the thing's lips move, the sounds get louder as he erupts in a fit of laughter. My throat is tight, and I take a step forward for some ungodly, unknown reason. He points at me again and laughs so loudly that I'm uncomfortable, and I can't stop staring back at his dead face, and I expect bugs to leave his lips any moment, but no, only laughter crosses them. "Dead," he repeats, just like yesterday. I'm not dead, and it stays silent. Its eyeless, darkness-filled skull still turned toward me with its permanent smile. I swallow heavily, and his lips stretch further. The more he smiles, the more grotesque he looks, and I can now see the grayed-out gums, the darkened teeth in the back, and the bloodless tongue inside his mouth. It almost looks like a rock, standing there behind a row of bony teeth. I shudder violently and repeat myself. I'm not dead, so what do you want with me? His smile finally fades away momentarily. The thing's head moves left and right so painfully slow that I can hear the bones of his neck crack with every slight movement. He's saying no. I didn't even know what the hell this thing was, but it had bones. I just don't know how to describe this floating dead eyeless child. I guess other than by ghost, maybe. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that he keeps pointing at me, his smile slowly returning. Dead. Fuck, man, I'm not dead. I'm not dead. And then I realize he's not pointing at me. He's pointing through me. He can't see me without his eyes, but he could see things I cannot even with eyes. Behind me, on the other side of the street, is Mrs. Tabby Johnson's house. I turn my head around to look at it briefly before my gaze snaps back to the kid who's starting to chant, "Dead, dead, dead," repeatedly. He manages to laugh at the same time, and I turn around to dash towards Mrs. Johnson's. I knock on the door as loudly as I can, calling out for her. Mrs. Johnson lived in this town for a little over 40 years. Everybody knows her. I know her. And now there's a creepy cemetery thing that knows her. I get no answer. I kick the door open and dash inside the house, and I'm assaulted with the putrid scent of decaying flesh. I feel like vomiting. I get my gun out of its holster and call out for Mrs. Johnson again, panic settling in my guts. When I finally find her, my knees buckle, and I have to hold myself against the nearest wall. It isn't a pretty sight, and I don't think I've ever seen something as scary in my entire life. Mrs. Johnson is sitting on her rocking chair, a thick ball of wool at her knees, and her 2 knitting needles buried in her eyes. She's been tied up with her own guts, and in her position, it almost looks like she's looking at me. I immediately call the station, and I leave through the front door before losing my dinner. I look at the cemetery just in time to see the kid vanish,